Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the meeting. So, update on sorry, I'm a bit fussy about my environment. Yes, right, that's better. Yes. So, update on single tablet regimens, clinical trials, and real-world data. I haven't covered much real-world data, to be honest. I'll mention it. This is a deliberately data-light presentation because anyone can go online and look at the graphs and the tables and the forest plots. So this is more thinking about concepts and comparisons. These are my conflicts of interest. I work in England. That makes me geographically biased and quite blinkered. I can't do anything about it. I will be using brand names. Whenever you speak on behalf of pharmaceutical companies, you're encouraged to not use brand names. I find it much easier. I'm not speaking on behalf of a pharmaceutical company. I might move between them interchangeably, but I will be using brand names in the interest of time because life is too damn short. So I'm going to be covering the lineup. What are our single tablet regimens that we have available? What do the guidelines say? What's the data? And some closing thoughts. So starting with the lineup, these are they. So these are our sort of, I think, the four big categories of core agents that are available as single tablet regimens. So we have 3 for dolutegravir, Dovato with lamivudine, Triomec with lamivudine and abacavir, and then Juluca. Who's prescribed Juluca in the last 12 months? Oh, a couple of you. Okay, the 3. Okay, that's a reasonable proportion of the assembled company. So yes, Bictegravir, of course, and Biktarvy are sort of very much dominating in some parts of the world. I was very struck by just how much of the US market is dominated by that particular STR. Doravirine with Delstrigo, tenofovir, disoproxil, and lamivudine, so it actually makes Doravirine quite unique. It's the only single tablet regimen with a tenofovir disoproxil rather than a TAF or no tenofovir at all backbone. And finally, darunavir in the form of Simtuza with TAF, emtricitabine, and boosted with co-formulated cobicistat. There are, of course, others that I've deliberately made smaller, which are the rilpivirine and elvitegravir-based single-tablet regimens. For rilpivirine, we have Eviplera and Adefsi with emtricitabine, and then tenofovir disoproxil or TAF, respectively. And for elvitegravir, Stribild and Genvoya, again, with tenofovir disoproxil or tenofovir alafenamide, respectively. And what I'm going to do in a really old-fashioned, horrible, hierarchical way is award a gold, silver, and bronze medal to each of these STRs. So let's move on to the guidelines quickly. What do they say? And what I've done is I've broken down 3 sets of guidelines and highlighted where the recommendation includes an STR option. So let's start with DHHS. And obviously for Bictegravir, for dolutegravir, Bictegravir and dolutegravir as Biktarvy and Triomec, of course, they are STRs. For dolutegravir, the tenofovir-based backbone, yes, there are STRs available, but generally not in high-income countries because that's where the use is permitted off patent. So actually quite frequently in the UK, we have people who've travelled to or migrated from other countries, and they're like, what do you mean you don't have TLD? That's ridiculous. Oh, we don't. Have 2 pills, or you can always drop the tenofovir, and we'll come on to that. Dolutegravir and lamivudine, of course, as Dovato available. And actually, I mean, I've gone for quite a retro theme with this horrible competition, I recognise, but it is a bit retro, isn't it, that the DHHS for the first time have actually put a protease inhibitor back in their first-line recommendations. It's been some time since they've had a PI up there. Now, it's only very specific indications, so the only reason that boosted darunavir is up there as a first-line option in DHHS is for people who've been exposed to cabotegravir PrEP, who haven't had a baseline resistance test. So I'm being a bit facetious, it's a very specific indication, but it just goes to show that things come around and they come back in and they go back out. What about the British HIV Association, of course, the set you're almost interested in? Everything available as an STR, again, other than the dolutegravir with a tenofovir-based backbone. And actually, other than that darunavir comparison, because we don't yet have cabotegravir for prevention in the UK, our guidelines are now identical to the DHHS, which isn't surprising because we actually follow very similar methodology for our guidelines development. So I think it's very reassuring, and it's a testament to that process that our recommendations are exactly the same. EACs take a slightly different approach. I'm not saying they don't look at the evidence, but they don't follow such a structured sort of guidelines process, and they're deliberately designed to be a bit more pragmatic. Therefore, they've always historically been broader. And again, fairly similar there. EACs is the only set that includes raltegravir as a kind of preferred first-line option. And of course, there are no single tablet regimens available for raltegravir. I think anyone, if you know what the raltegravir pills are like, I think it's highly unlikely anyone's going to be able to develop one that isn't incredibly big. And then, unlike DHHS and BEVA, EACTS also include an NNRTI-based first-line preferred option in the form of doravirine. And again, of course, that's available as an STR, though only with tenofovir disoproxil. So, as I mentioned, the data here is deliberately detail light. I'm just going to go through some of the key studies. Now, I'm going to disqualify rilpivirine and elvitegravir from the start. So not only are they not recommended as first-line preferred options, they both have significant limitations. Now, they have a role, and we've got many people on rilpivirine-based therapy at home. But in terms, especially for first-line therapy, we know rilpivirine underperforms at high viral loads. We know it has a low barrier to resistance. And if you look across all the different studies and you look at the risk of NRTI and NNRTI resistance at virologic failure, rilpivirine is probably our lowest barrier regimen that we're using today. Now, the number of virologic failures is small. It's very difficult to cross-compare, but you do see high rates of resistance to both those drug classes. Of course, there's the food requirement, and then there's the drug-drug interactions. And I think when we think about drug-drug interactions, I think in some ways a bit of toxicity through higher concentrations of a given drug is preferable to reduced antiretroviral exposure where you've got a higher risk of resistance development. And that's where rilpivirine is particularly weak, dare I suggest, because of that interaction with acid-reducing agents, particularly proton pump inhibitors. It does make it a little vulnerable. For elvitegravir, I mean, it's a bit of a no-brainer. It's a boosted drug with a low barrier to resistance. It's got everything you don't want in a regimen. Boosters are acceptable where you need them when it creates a high barrier. And for me, elvitegravir has always been quite weak in that regard. And again, the food requirement, relatively low barrier to resistance if you look at the integrase and NRTI resistance emergence. And of course, the manifold drug-drug interactions associated with boosters. So they're out. I'm also going to kick out Juluca. It's not widely used. I think it's got a really important role in a niche population of people, and I think it's always important to have choice. And one of the quite worrying directions we're having at home is it feels like a sort of increasing homogenization of what we're permitted to prescribe, because we have separate national processes to our national guidelines. And the commissioners and funders have got it into their heads that, well, if 90% of people are on those 3 or 4 regimens, why do you need the others? We need the others because everybody's individual, and when we lose the ability to customize treatment according to individual need, then I'd argue there's not much need for HIV specialists at all. Juluca, of course, has only been studied in suppressed switch. It's never been studied in people with viremia. There's that food requirement, the drug interactions, particularly with rilpivirine. But I do think it plays a role, but it's really not going to be a major player, and it's not going to be appearing on our STR Olympics podium. So that leaves us with this lot. So we've got 2 dolutegravir-based STRs, the bictegravir, doravirine, and darunavir. I apologise for that red box. It's because I sent not the most recent version of these slides. It's a little red note to myself. Apologies. So let's start with Simtusa. So Simtusa as an STR has been relatively understudied, really. There's just 2 main studies, Amber and Emerald, both comparing Simtusa with boosted darunavir in the case of Amber, a first-line study, or a mixture of boosted protease inhibitors in Emerald, which was a suppressed switch study. So clearly, if you've got the same drugs and the same drugs, it's a bit like looking in the mirror. So it's not surprising that Simtusa was non-inferior. Now, of course, I think what's uniquely beneficial with Simtusa is a single tablet regimen that arguably probably has the highest barrier to resistance. And I'll come on to sort of Nadia and D2F shortly. And I think it's still got an incredibly important role. Clearly, yes, it's boosted. It's got that food requirement. There's some debate over the importance of the small PK difference. When you boost darunavir with Cobi rather than ritonavir, you are more likely to be approaching subtherapeutic concentrations at the end of a dosing interval. And certainly when we've had people on low-level viremia on Simtusa, we've sometimes switched them to more pills with ritonavir. Now, that increase in pill burden versus those small potential PK benefits, it's a balance. But again, I think it's okay to use trial and error and switch people and switch back in the quest to ensure they achieve viral suppression. Now, think about darunavir boosted as a sort of concept, and this isn't about the STR, unfortunately, but in the absence of much more data, we need to extrapolate. Firstly, there's Flamingo, which I haven't included here, and Flamingo was a first-line open-label study comparing boosted darunavir with dolutegravir. Investigators selected abacavir or tenofovir-based backbones, and what Flamingo actually showed was statistical superiority for dolutegravir over darunavir overall, driven primarily by adverse events and more virologic failures in the high viral load group. Actually, if you look purely at the below 100,000 group, the virologic failure difference there wasn't a difference. But Nadia and D2F, so these are important studies, and I think they tell us something about the role of darunavir, particularly Nadia. So these are both studies undertaken in people who've experienced first-line virologic failure on an NNRTI-based regimen, and these are people with major NRTI resistance. We're talking like approaching 100% M184 rates, lots of TAMs, K65Rs present in some of them as well. Excuse me. So what Nadia did was finally say, do you know what, dolutegravir works well in people with lots of NRTI resistance. So it echoed the findings of Dawning. Dawning was dolutegravir versus lopinavir ritonavir in a similar population, and dolutegravir was superior. The argument was lopinavir ritonavir isn't really the optimal protease inhibitor, so Nadia addressed that with a dolutegravir darunavir head-to-head. And what it showed us is dolutegravir was non-inferior to darunavir. So when you've got that concern, you've got someone on a boosted PI, they've got lots of NRTI resistance, can you switch them to an integrase inhibitor? Actually, this would suggest you probably can, though we must emphasise that only dolutegravir has been challenged in this way. Whilst bictegravir on paper and in vitro would perform as well, we don't actually have the clinical data to support that. So what Nadia also showed us, though, is by week 96, a tenofovir-based backbone was superior to zidovudine, so everyone had experienced virologic failure on tenofovir in this study, but tenofovir was actually superior by week 96 to zidovudine. So this kind of mantra of never just change one drug, never replace one drug in a failing regimen, actually wasn't proven in Nadia, because simply replacing the NNRTI with dolutegravir or darunavir without changing the backbone was better than switching to zidovudine. The one thing it also showed us, though, and these are small numbers, I accept, but amongst the people who got virologic failure, if you were on a PI, there was no PI resistance emergence at week 96. But by week 96, you've got a small percentage of people with integrase resistance. So what does that tell us? That dolutegravir is going to be fine for most people. For the small number experienced virologic failure, there is that risk of integrase resistance. And where's that important? Actually, I'm thinking about some of our younger people with HIV, where you don't want to lose the integrase inhibitors early on. And we all know that adolescents go through that phase where perhaps adherence and commitment and rational thought is not yet fully developed. So keeping people held on a protease inhibitor in that scenario, I think, is entirely appropriate. And that's where Simtuza has a really important role. D2F was presented at CROI, and I think there's not enough information yet to fully draw conclusions about D2F. Similar population, 2 NRTIs, dolutegravir, 2 NRTIs, darunavir, or this dolutegravir-darunavir combo. Now, dolutegravir-darunavir combo was superior to 2 NRTIs and darunavir. It wasn't superior to 2 NRTIs and dolutegravir, and I think some of the reporting of this study hasn't quite got that nuance correct. One really important thing here, though, is most people on darunavir with 2 NRTIs were on a zidovudine backbone. So darunavir was disadvantaged by the backbone choice, and I think subsequent sub-analyses will be really important to really tease out. Is dolutegravir, darunavir, ritonavir ever going to be a feasible regimen at a global level? Probably not, though it does raise questions in high-income countries. What is the optimal treatment for people with extensive NRTI resistance? Have we got too complacent considering the number of options we have available? So ultimately, here's Simtuza. You've got the drug-drug interactions. You've got this cardiovascular disease risk association. I think is probably real because there's some biological plausibility because darunavir affects platelet function in a similar way to abacavir. Cohorts don't entirely agree, and we know from cohorts that you can never fully adjust for the confounders. That's why there's a question mark. But the advantage here is that barrier to resistance, which is why it still plays an important role. Let's move ahead to doravirine. So a mixture of studies here. I always get drive ahead and drive forward mixed up, so I'm sorry if I've got them wrong on this slide, but 2 first-line studies against efavirenz and ritonavir, darunavir respectively, and then drive shift against a variety of studies. These sort of suppressed switch studies when there's a real mixture of baseline regimens, I do think it limits the conclusions that we can draw from them. No head-to-head against an integrase. That's always the accusation thrown at poor old doravirine. I quite like NNRTIs, not the NNRTIs. I think doravirine's the optimal one. But no head-to-head, I guess, until CROI, where we saw doravirine islatravir versus bictegravir in suppressed switch, although that's a bit of a stretch. So the issues really for doravirine demonstrated in their studies is, again, that barrier to resistance. Now, the numbers of virologic failures are so small, but I think you could possibly argue it's got a higher barrier resistance compared to efavirenz. There is the fact it's co-formulated with tenofovir disoproxil, which is an advantage for some people and a disadvantage for others, depending on your views of those two different formulations of the same drug. And then, of course, there's a weight question. And, you know, is doravirine associated with less weight gain than some of the alternatives? Is it all because it's got a TDF backbone? There's studies looking specifically at switching people with excess weight gain to doravirine and TDF to see if that will answer that question. But I suspect weight will be something that we just move away from in the next couple of years and find something else to do lots of rubbish studies on instead. And finally, here's Biktarvy. So the big Biktarvy studies are GS1489 and 1490, both comparisons with dolutegravir. 1489 was the abacavir lamivudine backbone for dolutegravir, and 1490 was TAF emtricitabine. What they showed is dolutegravir and bictegravir performed pretty identically. Not surprising, because the chemical structures of those two drugs is pretty identical. There's a fluoride group and a couple of other things stuck on, but they're structurally very similar drugs, so I don't think it's surprising that they perform the same. I think some kind of erroneous conclusions drawn when people say that dolutegravir is less well tolerated than BIC based on 1489, where there was significantly more nausea and numerically more insomnia in the dolutegravir arm, but there were no differences in 1490. So if there were no differences with the same backbone, and the only tolerability differences were with different backbones, you don't need to be a rocket scientist to work out it was the backbone causing the difference. So what this revealed actually is abacavir is less well tolerated than TAF. Lots of suppressed switch studies, none in virologic failure, lots of extrapolation from a mixture of genotypic RNA and DNA resistance testing. Ultimately, Biktarvy hasn't been stressed in the same way as darunavir and dolutegravir, though theoretically it would work well in a Nadia or D2F type population. And then Dovato. Again, I'm sure you've all seen this data many, many times, but you've got the very large Gemini trial, 3-year data, more than 1,400 people in total randomized first line to Dovato or tenofovir emtricitabine dolutegravir. And I think inarguably it's performing just as well as a 3-drug regimen first line. Only one virologic failure with resistance in the Dovato arm after year 2. And then you've got these various dance move, tango, salsa, rumba, suppressed switch studies. Again, very reassuring for efficacy. Where they get a bit tricky is trying to tease out some of the metabolic differences, because when you've got a real mixture of baseline regimens, some boosted, some not, different backbones, particularly for salsa and rumba, but all very reassuring. And I think for Dovato, it's fair to say, certainly in terms of what's been collated, the biggest collation of real-world evidence. So more than 34,000 people now from various cohorts and case series summarised with data sets available. And I do think that's been a grand job in terms of collating all that data. And then Trimec. Now, Trimec's actually got no head-to-head comparison with any of the first-line preferred options anymore. And if we think about Dovato's efficacy, if we think about where would you not use Dovato, well, people with hepatitis B, people with 184, would you really want Trimec in that situation? I think some people do use Trimec in people with a 184, and of course 184 is conferring not just resistance to the lamivudine part of the backbone, but also reduced susceptibility to the abacavir part as well, which that's what's great about tenofovir, is the 184 is kind of boosting its efficacy up. You're still getting some activity from abacavir, but really what's Trimec adding? So let's get rid of Trimec. So for Trimec, you've got that partial abacavir activity, but you have got also, you must think about that cardiovascular disease risk. And again, I still speak to people who don't believe that abacavir increases cardiovascular risk. I think there is biologic plausibility. It's not just the platelets, it's the endothelial function signals as well. Abacavir mimics endogenous purines that mess around with cardiovascular health. So I'm pretty convinced that abacavir does increase cardiovascular disease risk. And there's something, let's be honest, about the NRTI class in a general. They're mimicking natural bits of the body. It's perhaps not surprising that they're interfering with some of those nucleotide-based mechanisms. So Trimec also, along with the others, has been disqualified. And now let's think about that bictegravir versus sort of dolutegravir comparison and thinking about, therefore, for STRs, it's Biktarvy versus Dovato. And I think clearly in the presence of NRTI resistance, you are going to be more trusting in a tenofovir-based backbone. I know there's various cohorts from Italy, for example, showing how well the dolutegravir works with the presence of a 184. There is accumulating evidence there, to be fair. I think we need proper trials to address that question. But the whole question around how long after a resistance mutation emerged, how long does it stay important for, I think is an interesting one. Is there a difference in weight? Is TAF driving a bit more weight gain? I'm still believing at the moment that TAF is driving a bit of weight gain. Data may emerge to refute that. And there is this insulin single signal in Tango, switching from TAF-based regimens, admittedly mainly in the boosted context, but even in the unboosted subset, removing TAF led to a numerical improvement in insulin sensitivity. Now, it disappeared after week 48, but what happens after more than a year is everyone's weight starts changing, and all those multifactorial things that govern things like insulin resistance start to diverge at later time points. And actually, even week 48 might be a bit late to looking at things like insulin resistance. We should perhaps be focusing on earlier time points when people are still more homogenized and matched to really address that question. So, based on everything I've said, I'm putting Simtuza in bronze. I'm putting Delstrigo in silver because I do think NRTI still play a role, and not everyone tolerates integrase inhibitors, though most do. I'm actually giving Dovato and Biktarvy joint gold medal, and that's a controversial decision, and in the old-fashioned Olympics this wouldn't be allowed, but this is the 2023 invented Olympics, so I'm giving them joint gold. But I just want to use one example of where actually you can't be as you know, black and white as I've been here. So imagining someone aged 21 with vertically acquired HIV with lots of NNRTI and NRTI resistance, who's suppressed on PI-based therapy, who's struggling at college. What STR is optimal here? And I'd argue in this example that it would have to be Simtuza until perhaps a later stage in their life when they were ready to think about switching to something alternative. So to close, one thing I've not mentioned at all, of course, is cost, and we have to think about cost. And at the UK, we've achieved major national savings by separating some single tablet regimens into their separate components. It's not popular, but it does save a lot of money. Is that the right thing to do or not? We can debate. Availability, I've touched on TLD, actually an example of better STR availability in low and middle income countries than the high income countries. And thinking about polypharmacy, and I think this is where my assumption's sometimes been, oh, if you're taking loads of pills already, why does an STR for your HIV matter? Similar argument for injectables, actually. If you're taking loads of pills, your metformin, your amlodipine, your God knows what else, your 18 vitamins, why can't you? And actually, when you talk to people, it does still matter. They'll look at all those pills, and it's the antiretrovirals that fill them with a sense of dread. It's the antiretrovirals that remind them of living with HIV. And that's where single tablet regimens, but also injectables for people, even if they are taking tablets for other things, can be really important. That's why it's important to explore. And of course, what I haven't included is what's the role of STRs as we move into an era of long-acting therapy, where we look back on STRs as the multi-tablet regimens of the future. But ultimately, we have to consider preference as well as the evidence. We need evidence that these drugs work, but I think where we're able to support it, we should always support patient choice. So thank you for listening. Sorry, I think I've probably overrun by a couple of minutes, but thank you for your kind attention nonetheless.